Hi, folks. Welcome to the 17.7 pod. Today we are talking about the global carbon reward with Dr. Delton Chen and Injy Johnstone. I'm joined with my co-host, Florin Durieux, and the date today is 8th of May, 2024. Injy mentioned this Ministry for the Future book. I'd recommend everyone to read in it. It's a good read, exciting. It's a kind of global warming thriller type thing, mixed in with lots of good scientific ideas, lots of real projects mentioned, I think, throughout the book, and Delton's ideas about global carbon reward are kind of central, actually. And at some point, the main protagonist in the book manages to persuade some central banks to actually get their finger out and do something about the global heating crisis we face. And I think this is a very interesting idea, right? So, I mean, in my line of work with Open Bank Project, I've come across some central banks around the world. All good people, keeping their economies straight and narrow, and I don't normally associate them with thrillers set in Switzerland and and all the rest of it. But we live in uncertain and changing times, right? And this idea of a new carbon asset, and Delton, you can correct me if I'm wrong, right? But maybe I can paraphrase it without any notes. Oh dear. But basically, it's so the central banks. The idea is that central banks, one or more, and we can talk about that, they will issue these coins to organizations who are A, keeping carbon in the ground, or B, are taking it out of the air, right? Is that okay? I failed at the first hurdle. Damn it! Let me go. Let me go to my notes. Okay, almost.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's right, though, isn't it? If Shell says, okay, we're not going to extract this 100 million tons of oil of stuff, which would result in 100 million tons of CO2 going into the atmosphere, then they would be eligible to get some of these carbon reward coins, or whatever the currency ticker is going to be, as long as it stays in the ground for 100 years, right?
That last part is really important, and yes,
Yeah.
that's potentially a huge component of the policy, paying to keep fossil fuels in the ground. But the earlier part with the central banks is, I think, a part that most people get wrong, actually.
Okay.
Central banks won't issue the coin because they don't have the expertise. They wouldn't want to do the measurement, reporting, verification, and it needs to be managed from a new institution that does this service on behalf of the global community. So
right.
it'll be a very large UN-based organization, kind of like the IPCC, except doing measurement, reporting, verification, and all the administration and deep thinking to get the policy to work strategically. So we've called it the Carbon Exchange Authority, but the novel actually calls it the Ministry for the Future. So we could call it the Ministry for the Future, if you like.
Cool. That's a much more kind of sexy name, actually.
Yeah. So the Ministry of the Future issues the carbon coin. That's the plot structure. Well, I assume it is in the novel. Maybe I've got that wrong, but I would hope it is.
Mm.
And then the central banks come in to buy the carbon coin when it's necessary to keep the value of that carbon coin above a price
Okay.
floor.
Okay. Okay. So
Okay, so
that's the
that's their role.
yeah. So
Mm.
the role of the central banks is to say, okay, we're going to support this. We're going to buy this currency. So you mentioned it, maybe XCC. Is that right? That's the ticker name.
Yes,
Uh,
I came up with that ticker name, XCC. I think it's pretty cool actually, but it's not arbitrary because there are assets in foreign exchange markets
yeah. Yeah.
for
Yeah. Yeah.
precious metals, XAU for gold, XAG for silver.
Okay. Okay.
And so it's analogous to that, but it's going to be
Okay.
for carbon.
Okay. And then another important part of it is that if Shell gets, I don't know, uh, 100 million of these coins, right, in return for not developing an oil field in Nigeria, let's say, right, the important thing is that they cannot sell those coins to BP, and then BP can claim that they kept the they kept the oil in the ground, right? So you can't transfer around um, the kind of social good of these coins, right? But you can sell them for euros, or so if the European Central Bank supports this currency, then the European Central Bank would buy these tokens, uh, and there's a floor price to it, right? So I printed this from your Bank of England chat talk, right?
That's the one.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's the one.
that's it. Yeah. So I'll just clarify what you just said there,
Mm,
Simon.
yeah.
Um, I do call it a carbon currency, but very important, it's not actually a currency, really. It's just a name because people can familiarize themselves with it, but it's not going to act as a medium of exchange. You can't buy anything with it. In fact, it'll be not allowed, in my opinion. So it's not going to compete with US dollars or euros. It's purely an asset. And also, as Injy would appreciate, the carbon currency, carbon coin, or whatever you want to call it, carbon asset, it's not a carbon credit and it's not a carbon offset. So it's kind of in a class of its own. And this is where I think we're all going to struggle a bit at first to understand what it is because it doesn't actually exist in textbooks. So it's a financial asset that does not permit the transferability of carbon. So if you were to sequester 100 tons of carbon dioxide through some amazing technology of your own,
Mm,
you could earn a lot of carbon currency,
mm,
but you can't then take the currency and give it to someone else so they can offset. That's not allowed. The carbon's all retired,
mm.
and the funding model doesn't require offsetting or doesn't depend on it. So Injy would appreciate that one of the motivations for carbon offsetting is to generate some finance for these people in developing countries who need funding for a forestry project or something. So the offsetting came in early in the piece around the Kyoto Protocol era
Mm.
through the clean development mechanism because they wanted to generate some finance. And it's difficult to raise money when you ask for grants or donations from countries, developed countries, because they don't really want to give you any money. So it's the next best option to generate a bit of finance through this offsetting type market. But as we've learnt over the years, offsetting introduces its own risks and it doesn't actually mitigate um, in the conventional sense. It's sort of like a quasi mitigation that brings to the table new risks. And importantly, in my opinion, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this, in my opinion, carbon offsetting actually, its primary function is to lower the cost of mitigation for polluters. That's what it does financially.
Injy, do you want to speak to that maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to come in here. And I think so. It raises a number of important points, even right from the start. I mean, even that we should distinguish between a carbon credit and its function as an offset. So offsetting is, it's a verb. It's what you do with a unit. Often that is a carbon credit, and a carbon credit is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, and that could represent a ton of CO2 equivalent that is avoided, reduced, or removed from the atmosphere. Now, the vast majority of the voluntary carbon market today, and what also are the type of projects that are also hitting the headlines in terms of uh, issues of whether they even A, exist, or B, actually doing what they say they're doing on the longer term, are these avoided emissions projects. And so the carbon removal piece, which is often what people first think of when they think of the carbon market, they think of people planting trees. It actually only makes up less than 10% of the overall voluntary carbon market. And then within that, we have even a fewer amount of removals that are actually storing carbon on timescales that are meaningful for net zero.
Mm.
And all of these are an issue because carbon credits don't have to be used as offsets. Some people don't, and some people are retiring them as a climate contribution. But by far and away, the most common use is for offsetting purposes, and that is where it's compensating for a ton of CO2 that is otherwise being released.
Can you give an
Now,
example? Can you give an example, Injy, of this 90%?
yeah, absolutely. So the biggest types of projects are what's called REDD Plus, which is where you're conserving rainforest. You're paying someone not to chop down an area of land that you have to evidence through a counterfactual
Okay.
baseline that it might be under threat. But what's really interesting, and tying back to what Delton said about, these concepts have been around for a while, right back to the Kyoto Protocol, which was first agreed in 1997. And what's interesting when you go back to the negotiations then, actually they realized that avoiding emissions, so that would include both maybe protecting these rainforests, but also paying people to keep carbon in the ground, they actually viewed that as a form of adaptation rather than mitigation. And they viewed, carbon removal as this mitigation function, as well as these emission reduction projects. For example, if you're installing a kind of scrubber onto an existing coal-fired gas plant or something to reduce the emissions going out to the atmosphere. And so
Mm.
it's really interesting because these concepts have been around for a while, but oftentimes, and as we see in terms of these conversations today, we get this frequent confusion, and that is really important, especially when these claims, such as offsetting, but not limited to it, are being made off the back of these projects.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I'd like to add something, if I may, Simon. In this discussion so far, time was mentioned. So there's a need to make sure that carbon that is removed from the atmosphere or sequestered or avoided remains mitigated for the long term. If
Mm.
it comes back to the atmosphere, if it leaks out, say a forest degrades or burns down,
Mm.
you have a serious problem. So
Mm.
because this is a real issue and risk, the unit of account for the carbon reward, aka carbon coin, is mitigated strategically for 100 years or more. Okay,
Mm.
so there's a
Mm.
limit there. We'd regard 100 years to be sufficient. And if carbon is not mitigated for that 100 years, say it's mitigated for only 50 years, we can pro rata the accounting. So there's some flexibility to give some rewards for projects that mitigate for some of that time, but if their carbon leaks out, there has to be a pro rata adjustment. So
So,
that's the deep topic.
okay. So then, because Florin, I think you had a question about that when we were talking like yesterday about this. Uh, say Shell says, yeah, we're going to keep this oil field in the ground, right? And they get the carbon rewards, the currency, and then the government comes along and nationalize, basically takes the oil field back, and then just says, no, actually, we're gonna develop this anyway, right? So then somehow you get the coins back from Shell then, or how would that work. And at a related topic, so I think someone mentioned community, and I was listening to another podcast that you did, Delton, and you said that it's very important that that communities are involved in like managing or involved in the carbon in the ground, right? So so that it doesn't just in other words, well, you could just speak to that, please.
Yeah, sure. There's two big questions you've posed, so I'll have to tackle them one at a time. The first question was, what happens if Shell earns a lot of carbon rewards and then the lease is transferred back to the government or sold to another entity? Well, first of all, when nations and governments agree to participate, they will formally sign on to an international agreement where they will commit themselves to abide by the rules. So they will be helping to enforce the rules of the policy, not breaking them. It would be unusual and extreme for a government to break the rules of its own policy that it signs onto. But if it did, the ledger technology would be such that we could recall that carbon coin from Shell before they transfer it to another entity. If they were, if we knew that they're going to try and corrupt the system. I think that would be very unlikely, but the technology is available to do that because it would all be part of a contract. Shell would enter into a voluntary contract, including service level conditions and performance agreements. So the key part of this type of agreement, which is called an energy asset exchange, requires Shell to commit to not only leaving the fossil fuels in the ground, they need to take that reward, and this will be written into their contract, and use most of it to build out renewable energy that the world needs.
Right.
Now, so that they would receive market value approximately for the fossil fuels which they're not mining, and the choice of which company and which oil and gas field to leave in the ground is a strategic one. It won't be random. There will be teams of experts to make those decisions, which oil and gas and coal fields should be left in the ground. And then there will be some kind of process of reverse auctions to the owners of those energy reserves to participate in the reward policy, or it could be a direct negotiation.
Can I just jump in here quickly? Because I think one thing, well, it raises a number of questions, and I really like Delton as well, that in some of your work, you reflect on the fact that it's kind of this model of just energy transition partnerships emerging and becoming more popular. But I think one big question here, and it is in terms of paying for fossil fuels to remain in the ground, is on the one hand, we have these assets that are already becoming stranded assets in many times, and obviously that could influence the negotiation, the price paid. Because I think, oil and gas extractors would be very lucky to get present and future value, currently for their provable reserves in a world that we know that most of that, nearly all of it, has to remain unburned. But it also, raises this question, and it was also discussed at the recent COP at COP28. So the Philippines wanted avoided emissions being paid to keep your fossil fuels in the ground to be an activity under Article 6.4. But the biggest pushback is that there was pushback from countries about that. And the biggest concern was just that because there's such an array of emissions reductions and removal activities that we already have to fund, that there's simply not the money to kind of pay and compensate for these assets that might otherwise and hopefully will be soon stranded assets. There's still a lot of equity implications there, and I think that's why the Just Energy Transition Partnership model is the right one. But I was just keen to hear your reflections on both the stranded assets part and then this common concern which countries also share about under Article 6, that if you're opening the gates to funding that, then you might not be able to get the funding for the emissions reductions, and particularly the carbon removal, which is the expensive stuff, which unfortunately we look like we'll need.
Yes, I'll start with carbon removal. So very, very quickly, according to the best science, that even in the most optimistic scenario where we manage to reduce our emissions globally at a very, 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 very fast rate, we still will need removal to the scale of 10 to 20 gigatons per annum. And who's going to pay for that? So this policy is actually structured specifically to fund that, fully fund the removal. That's the first thing. The other point of conversation, quite rightly, is the JETP. These new consortia of banks and governments that help fund keeping, say, coal in the ground, I think in Indonesia or some other places. The global carbon reward energy asset exchange idea is very similar to that. I think it's a good analogy, except that the carbon reward, the advantage is that we don't have to go scrounging for the money. We have a scalable financial asset that's self-funding, because the carbon reward that's traded in the foreign exchange, it actually acts as a low risk or limited risk investment. And this might be hard to understand how it becomes self-funding. It's kind of almost a bit magical in a way at first, but it makes sense because what's happening actually is the value of the carbon currency has to rise over time. The carbon reward, carbon currency, carbon coin, its value rises because we're using it to fund the carbon removal that we need. It's priced to that. And then we underwrite that with central bank promise to act as the buyers of last resort, so people can trust that its value will rise. And that invokes the animal spirits of the marketplace. The animal spirits meaning that traders and investors can believe that this public finance guarantee is real. The banks guarantee to perform that role. And so it shifts sentiment, and people will buy the carbon currency. Thanks, Simon. Yeah, that's the graph. You can see it on the website and in presentations. So that comes from the Bank of England presentation. Now, there's more to it, though. It gets quite technical because the other part of the conversations, besides removal, is conventional mitigation, including fossil fuels and keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And that actually requires a more flexible approach. It's not simply a price signal. It's the ability to negotiate with these industries and sectors, including the energy sector, to essentially swap out of fossil fuels. As I said earlier, pay them to keep the coal or natural gas in the ground where it's most logical to do so, but they have to sign on to a contract where they have to use that reward to fund the renewable energy rollout. Now, the topic of stranded assets. If you're a fossil fuel company and you do have these assets and you can see the energy transition coming quickly, you must be a bit scared because you have an expectation of a profit owning these reserves and assets. Now, at first, I think big companies will move quickly into this reward because they can figure out that the sooner they take the reward for these marginal reserves, particularly in the Congo Basin, the Amazon Basin, where it's doing a lot of damage, as soon as they can offload that and realize some market value, they're de-risking their portfolio of energy assets. Right?
Can I just ask about this stranded assets thing? Because we hear the phrase, but are these assets really becoming stranded? Like, are there, I mean, I hope so, right? But is it really happening? Are there, Injy, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Again, it's if we look at a different part of the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1c, which is designed to kind of shift, the overall financial architecture, I guess, away from this unaligned Paris state we have now to a more aligned scenario. There's meant to be signals there that are, distilling down the various, but right from the multilateral development banks into central banking decisions and everything to kind of channel funds away from these fossil fuel intensive sectors. I think, I think it's a good question. So I think there's pressure on financial institutions to adjust their books essentially, but then what we can't have is that I don't know, banks headquartered in the UK, for instance, and not saying that they're all doing this, but you know, you don't want that. Basically, you don't want paper decarbonisation. So you don't want them to shift their funding, and then you have,
Mm.
I don't know, yeah, some of the other banks or sovereign nations willing to step in, and that's the biggest thing actually, is that a lot of because when doing some research about like the financial interdependence of fossil fuel nations, entities, a lot of them, you know, are very fiscally kind of shored up already. So they're not dependent if a bank turns out off its supply of, you know, a low interest loan, for instance. Yeah, they're quite immune from that. So that's why I think we do have to be thinking quite differently about how to approach that. But yeah, it still comes back to that concern about if, yeah, even with this model, that if like how to get that funded, because, and just for context for the audience, so when Delton said we need 10 to 20 gigatons, so that's 10 to 20 billion tons, and right now we're removing less than 2 billion tons a year. And the issue with treating, well, currently what we have in the voluntary carbon market as well, and the reason why there's so few removals that are occurring is because the price difference is enormous between what you have to pay for to avoid an emission versus what you have to do to actually build out that infrastructure to be able to remove and store carbon on timescales. So we have projects that are ranging anywhere from a few cents right up to $2,000 per ton for some of the most advanced. And so that's why I think, yeah, this conversation about how to fund that is really interesting. And also because we need to be developing those more expensive technologies today to bring that cost curve down. So I think there's some parallel discussions about how to bring that together with a global carbon reward price that is rising over time.
So part of the role of the global carbon reward is actually to encourage investment into CDR technologies and stuff like that. Is that right, Delton? That's part of the because at the moment, right? I don't know. I pay 80 euros a month to Climeworks, right? They have this machines in Switzerland or in Iceland, you know, and I don't know. I very rarely fly, but I flew to Ireland a couple of months ago for a 60th birthday, and I thought, shit, you know. And I looked at, you know, the carbon that that emitted. It was significant, right? And I'm going to have to pay for, I don't know, 6 months or at least, or 7, 8 months. I don't know. My maths is not that good sometimes, but you know, it's a significant number of months and a significant number of euros to take that carbon out of the air, right? Caused by this party that I went to, right? So I guess, yeah, there needs investment to happen into these technologies. That's the point, right, Delton?
Oh, so much so. There are so many issues here for carbon removal from the atmosphere, ambient atmosphere, and storing it. For one, it's expensive. Two, takes a lot of energy input, whether the energy is from engineered sources or from the sun, as in photosynthesis. And for humanity to be able to draw out, say, 10 to 20 gigatons, that's a huge amount, right? Very, very, very challenging concept, even to wrap your mind around it. How would the private sector or even governments go about building out that kind of level of infrastructure, whether it's marine-based or terrestrial-based? How would they do it? Because it's going to be hugely expensive. Now, the way capitalism works, if you're an investor, you don't take risks like that because, one, who's going to fund or pay for the service? It has to be granted because it's not a service that humanity is willing to pay for voluntarily. It's a bit like waste management. I guess we pay taxes for the garbage to be collected, but who's going to invoke a tax for this globally when we don't have that level of cooperation? So we need to fund it, right? And it needs to be reliable funding for one very good reason. If you're going to set out to build a big project to pull out these many billions and trillions of tons of CO2, right? You're talking big money, and that means high capex projects, and investors won't take that risk unless there is a reliable financial reason to into the long term, because it's going to be a 20, 30, 40-year project.
Yeah.
So you need that long-term revenue source so that you can prove that the project is bankable, financeable. And the only way you can do that is to have some sort of bankable income. And that's what the carbon reward does. It's a bankable revenue source. Why? Because it's officially supported by central banks, so it is bankable. And then when private sector does plan to build out something, whatever technologies they might want to use, they will then invest millions and billions into research and development because there is a business model, there's a business case. So if you do have this century-long price signal, it's backed by central banks, it's bankable, it's believable, then huge amounts of money will pile into R&D. And why? Because if you develop some technology which is even 10% better than everyone else's, you're going to make a lot of money if you can go to scale. Because remember, there's these trillions of dollars having to be spent on this service. And if you can also combine it with goods and services that maybe come out of it, if you're lucky enough, maybe the carbon you draw from the atmosphere can be used somehow, then there's supplementary revenue.
And there are strings attached to what you can do with the money from the carbon coin, right? That's an important point. So so Shell gets these 100 million XCC tokens, and they need to use that, the money they can get from that in a responsible way, and that's important because we don't want we need the alternative energy sources to come up, because otherwise there will be a pressure on energy sources, because if we leave the oil in the ground, it might get more expensive. So we need these alternative sources to balance that price, right?
Actually, I would have a question on this whole dynamics between companies, countries, and the Carbon Exchange Authority, and also the actual currency that is being now used, or commodity that is being used, this XCC. I would wonder if the Carbon Exchange Authority is a prerequisite to all of this happening. So all of the pieces would fall into place if that authority is being set in place. Is that a fact, Delton?
Yes, like the way I envision the Carbon Exchange Authority, the Ministry for the Future, whatever you want to call it, it's going to be a very thoughtful and resourced organization that will have a lot of scientists who will look at the carbon budget for civilization, and they're going to strategically try and figure out what needs to be decarbonized and in what order and in which industry and sectors. So, for example, we use an example of Shell. If Shell leaves a lot of oil, coal, and gas in the ground, what are you going to replace it with? So if you're thinking over here, you're thinking, let's decarbonize the shipping sector, what will they need? Is it green hydrogen, or is it green ammonia, or is it electric batteries? Maybe it's all three. So you have to kind of match the energy demand with the supply, and it's that matching of energy supply demand that's part of the strategy. So you might call this somewhat of a top-down planning, and it is. It's strategic planning and prioritization of industries, because an organization like this, it can grow quickly, but it can't do everything at once. So it's going to have to prioritize, I'd say, starting with a really nice problem of keeping fossil fuels in the ground in forested parts of the world. That's a good place to start. That will attract a lot of support and attention, I believe, from around the world. And then it can begin to experiment in other sectors, say aviation, shipping, cement, steel, buildings, and so on, and just gradually building up the reward rules and contracts for all these different sectors, but in a managed way. Because if you don't have the energy supply matching the energy demand, you're going to see energy prices being more volatile, and we want to avoid that.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
that's actually a good point about the rising prices of energy, because right now burning oil and gas and coal is cheap, because we have our civilization has gotten to a point where producing energy from these fossil fuels became very, very cheap. And I think solar is getting a bit there, but it's still, I think it has some ways to go. Question is that going to destabilize the price of energy? And I think you've alluded to that, Delton. But I think, like, in the long term, this would eventually stabilize. Question is it going to stabilize at a higher level? So does the civilization take a hit in doing the what's right for us in terms of making our lives more expensive, at least in the short term?
There are economic models that look at this question. If you want the references, I can give them to you after the interview or this webinar. But there are at least two models that incorporate the physical limits of energy resource limits in the economic model. It's called stock and flow modeling coupled to the economy. And they have determined that to achieve the 1.5, we would have to invest so much in the new energy that it will materially reduce the amount of wealth available for consumption. So there will be less invested in regular consumption and more into the clean energy transition. And the estimate is that the savings rate for this would increase from about 26% of GDP today to about 40% of GDP. And that scenario is somewhat simplistic. The models aren't taking into account everything, but that's definitely the case. The investing in the clean energy transition will crowd out consumption. That means everybody would have to tighten their belts, whether they do it voluntarily or not.
I'd like to push back on that a little bit, because I think some of the deployment scenarios we've seen from the IEA, they've said that actually that they've even been surprised by the rapid uptake of renewable energies in the past even few years, and in response to COVID, but also in response to the war in Ukraine, because I think it kind of showed that, fundamentally, oil and gas and coal as such is a finite asset, right? And so if we're shifting from a finite source to these renewable sources, that long term, it might require this shift in investment now. But not only are they cost competitive in many sectors already, but that they provide that renewable source, which is not locking us into that risk of volatility that we did see with gas prices in the EU and such. And so, and not only that, because also one of the big factors when comparing fossil fuels to renewable energy is the avoided deaths that we have from particulate pollution and other aspects like that. So, I think, it's an area that is really rapidly increasing, and that's why our models, that even from early 2010s and going on from that, they do have to be continually updated to reflect these market conditions and how we value these different aspects of our global economy, including the productivity from avoiding deaths from an economist's perspective, but the very material differences in lives that it can bring as well.
Mm-hmm. Could I just follow on from Florin's questions? He was asking, do we need this ministry for the future? And the answer is yes, because it's kind of gonna direct where these XCC will go. So a related question to that is, how many central banks do we need to support this floor price of XCC? Can we start with one central bank, and then how would that relate to the volume of XCC which can be supported over time and so on?
I suppose I should answer that question. I think one is not enough. I think we need 3 countries at a minimum, because you need to demonstrate the carbon quantitative easing program, which makes much more sense when you have more than one central bank, because there's a certain averaging going on in the level of quantitative easing by each country's central bank. Also, when you have a group of 3 countries, it's sort of small enough to be a pilot. And then the theory of change is that that pilot with a few countries is what will get the ball rolling. So from that, you can demonstrate it, report it, discuss it at conferences and central bank meetings. And if the public is able to see this, if the environmentalists and the progressive politicians see it, they might realize that there's something important here, and then we can have a discussion and review the policy.
Yeah, cool. I think it's always good to have more than one of something, right? If we say that in software engineering, you know, it's always good to have more than one to prove the case or so. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, the timing will be about right too. If a pilot were to go ahead, let's say in the next 3 to 5 years, by that time, my prediction, I don't have a crystal ball, but I predict that politicians will be under a lot more pressure in 5 years, because we'll be past 1.5 degrees and we'll be looking at 2 degrees.
And do you have any central banks in mind, Delton, that you're knocking on the doors of?
I could tell you which ones probably I don't have in mind, because some of them are just too big to even contemplate talking to.
Okay.
I'm thinking any small, medium-sized country in Africa, Southeast Asia, Central South America, some parts of Europe, maybe Eastern Europe, Scandinavian countries, maybe Ireland, but not the big ones. They're a bit too complex.
What about the European Central Bank?
I put it in too difficult basket for beginning, the pilot.
Okay.
I think this isn't my opinion. I don't really know. It's an assumption. My assumption is that developing countries are hungrier for a change to the financial system, because there is this history of neocolonialism, and the way the global financial system is structured, it tends to favor the developed countries. So if you want to change the system, you need a reason, and that there is a reason from the perspective of low-income countries.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting, given that there's these developments, obviously, in terms of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and that we're seeing as this turn to financializing and trying to internalize this external cost of carbon. It can lead to these inequitable outcomes. And so I think there's a case there both to say to the G7, if you're going to make this carbon club, this is one of the aspects that should be part of it, but then also, like you said, Delton, to experiment and to attract more diverse voices and to get some strong leverage behind it. One other aspect I wanted to bring up, just while we're talking about a UN entity and in this space, is that we do have, so Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is set up to kind of, I guess, in essence, be the global offsetting mechanism for countries. And so coming back to what Delton said at the start, Article 6 is designed to make the mitigation efforts towards Paris cheaper for countries, so that you have a developed country in one nation that purchases an emission reduction or removal in another, and that gets transferred from one country's nationally determined contribution-based inventory to another country's, where it's then claimed. And one of the biggest issues in the space has been, I mean, it's really difficult to get good rules agreed to by all countries, and especially so because a lot of countries see the space of carbon markets and these projects. They do see there's economic opportunity, both to make the cost of meeting their own domestic targets cheaper, but also in terms of attracting, capital to fund development projects in national context. But they have this real reticence often, because as soon as you start putting in place some of these rules, they really do see it as infringing, their sovereign rights and their ability to make these kind of decisions and to trade in this kind of way. So, and we see that already with some of the fights that are happening in terms of the UN body set up to oversee it, which is the Article 6.4 supervisory body. And so I think there can be a lot of interesting lessons to be learned from this current model of how nations are organizing the kind of country level global carbon market, and that will also be one that is open to the private sector, in terms of how to then shape and inform a much more robust entity, which the Global Carbon Reward, I think, both requires, but is also very much needed, because ultimately the supervisory body right now is overseen by diplomats rather than scientists. And so it's probably no wonder why we have an outcome so far that looks very unaligned to Paris. But I think there's important lessons to be learned from that to where we need to go with the Global Carbon Reward.
Interesting. And could I just ask about, say we have 3 countries, right? Would those countries or the Ministry of the Future would then like target projects in those countries? So the countries would benefit because they are, yeah, they're kind of encouraging stuff in their own backyard type thing, or would they, or would the Ministry of the Future say, well, actually, this project in this country is, you know, is worthy of receiving the coins? How would that work, Delton?
Well, if they actually did have their central bank printing new bank reserves to fund this carbon coin, my guess is that they would like to see that wealth transfer into their own national economies, even if it's just a pilot, because it's more politically favorable for them as politicians. If they said that their central bank was supporting projects in foreign countries, people probably look at them twice and say, well, what are you doing? I think it's more likely. And unless it's a very small project and the amount of money is trivial, but I think the pilot will probably be, that's why Africa is a good location, because the Congo Basin is very large, and some of those countries in that region probably have oil gas that's causing problems. There's the pollution, there's the tendency for corruption and for revenues to be siphoned off because, well, they're selling the oil on global markets, oil and gas, but they might not be getting good prices for it. You know, the business relationships with the energy companies that are partnering or buying the leases, you don't really know what the economics is. So there could be multiple reasons for developing countries to consider this energy asset exchange. In fact, if you listen to Africans speak in the media and in webinars like this one, they will talk about all the problems they face in raising capital, financial capital to build renewable energy. So they have sovereign risk they have to factor into the loans. So they're paying a lot higher interest rates on loans from commercial banks, development banks. And then you have to build a market for the energy as well. So it's not easy for them. And that's why they tend to fall back on their oil, gas, and coal, because it's a reliable source of revenue, even though there are environmental costs.
Now, in this model with banks, this 3 banks, let's say pilot model, it is those very banks that they will have to sustain the price, the floor price, let's say. Correct?
Yes, that's true. Right. That's why it's probably a good idea to have a fairly small pilot, not to be too macroeconomic to start with. You don't need to save the whole world in a pilot, just maybe retire one oil and gas lease in the Amazon or in the Congo type.
Yeah, my puzzle here is that these, so let's say we're talking about a few countries in Africa or maybe Southeast Asia. Those very banks are the ones who probably represent an economy mostly oriented around energy, and they would have to sustain this kind of model where that the energy generation will not be anymore done through fossil fuels. So I wonder how that dynamic would work. So if I'm thinking about multiple banks, including banks in developed countries, let's take Norway, who is accumulating a lot of wealth as a result of fossil fuel extraction, they would be able to sustain a floor price. But countries in the Congo Basin, they are actually dependent on oil extraction and gas extraction, and that very resource will be, let's say, locked out as a result of applying this policy. How would they be able to sustain the floor price?
Mm-hmm. Well, this comes back to the notion that in the full application of the carbon reward, it would involve roughly 80% of the world's central banks. That would be sufficient. So if you imagine that 80% of the world's central banks, or even all of them, are participating in this carbon quantitative easing, they're not at risk economically, because they only have to back or buy enough carbon currency according to a formula. So the formula instructs every central bank to print a certain amount of bank reserves and buy a certain amount of the carbon coin at any given time. And that amount is always proportional, essentially proportional to the size of the economy. So if you have economy, I'll just come up with a random example, let's say Thailand, its economy is going to be much smaller than, say, Germany or United States. So the amount of money printing that's involved is proportionally smaller. And the effect of the formula is to ensure that the extra money being created, this is fiat money, not carbon coin, but fiat money, is such that the monetary inflation is essentially uniform for every currency that participates. So this is a very important point. If the monetary inflation is essentially the same for every participating currency, it doesn't make the inflation go away, but it makes it invisible, more or less invisible, because it doesn't disrupt the exchange rates in international trade. Because you're basically kind of treating all the currencies in the world as one currency. And if you increase the supply of all the world's currency at the same rate, prices will essentially stay the same. What you're doing is they're not going to change because of differences in currency values between countries. So it tends to hide the inflationary effect.
Exactly. So I'm actually thinking of, so when we introduced euro here in Europe, the effect of that was to more or less equalize the inflation or bring it much closer from the various levels that they were in various countries. And I'm actually wondering if this carbon coin reward will not effectively, and this is actually not a bad thing, will not aim to equalize, or at least to make the inflations across all of the participating parties more uniform, thus reducing the imbalances across these at the country or macro level more than just an individual or a three pilot type of experiment, which I think it's a good thing. It might actually, the consequences at the system level might be much larger than trying to reduce the carbon, and more into the macroeconomic realm, where they might actually start, this coin might start representing a medium of exchange that is equally understood by all parties, knowing that today we have the dollar, who is holding a different type of level of medium of exchange with respect to many others, including to the euro or other regional.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like a kind of, maybe it's a kind of emergent property we get from like having to consider CO2 in the atmosphere, which crosses all boundaries and all places, and even goes into the sea, right? So maybe we get an emergent property which is reflecting.
I have to interrupt because Florin made a cardinal sin.
Oh, he said medium of exchange.
Yes, it's not a medium of exchange. It's a store of value. So, because if it were a medium of exchange, it could then be used to buy and sell goods and services, and then it would compete directly with the US dollar, for example. But
Mm.
as long as it stays only a store of value, it removes all the geopolitical complexity. So, but I think what you correct me if I'm wrong, you might have been alluding to the fact it becomes the focus of the world's desire to act in a unified way together, all countries, by agreeing to an asset that has a common value, and the commonality is supported by the balanced carbon quantitative easing, but it's also supported by the notion that we all collectively need a safe climate. It doesn't matter whether you're Chinese or German or New Zealand or Irish, you know, we all need climate. So it does make sense from the perspective of governance that we would have an international store of value to protect us. I suppose the carbon tax was supposed to be that, but I think that comes back to theory.
Maybe you could talk to this diagram a little bit, right? Because you just mentioned carbon tax and this kind of carrot and stick type thing. We haven't talked. Maybe you could talk about why a tax is stick and talk about that a little bit.
Sure. This might start to get a bit technical or heady, so I'll try and keep it really simple.
Cool.
I'll try. I can't promise. Carrots and sticks. Everybody's heard of carrots and sticks. As children, I assume our parents offer us lollies if we're good, or the belt if we're bad. They're carrots and sticks. And in fact, you know, nation states use carrots and sticks to influence each other. And there's a reason, and the reason it often works. So there are actually scientific studies looking at carrots and sticks, and they found it does maximize cooperation in these game type environment. So what's interesting about that diagram that Simon was showing us is that there is a matrix format that's symmetric based on the two rows are the store of value options, sticks or carrots, and then the columns are the unit of account options, fiat or carbon. So carbon mass or the national fiat currency, because these are the main options, right? You know that money has four functions: medium exchange, store of value, social agreement, and unit of account. So here we don't need the medium of exchange because we're not trying to create money, we're just creating a market policy. Now, based on that analysis, I claim that textbooks have identified the tax, the cap and trade, and the subsidy, but it's missing the carbon reward, which technically is also a mitigate and trade. So if you think of cap and trade, what we're dealing with here is actually mitigate and trade. So that explains a lot. Now, nobody's really designed a mitigate and trade policy before, and nobody's actually put a price on systemic risk before, not in market economics. So there's a mapping here of different ideas. One idea that's mapped onto that is that there is distinct difference between costs and risks. So in neoclassical economics, when the economists try to estimate the social cost to carbon, which is the damage, they can do that. They can estimate it somehow with lots of assumptions, but they notice that they have a bell curve. And some economists like Weitzman, for example, who's debating with Nordhaus, he said, look, this bell curve has got a fat tail, and like, what do we do about the possibility that our damages are going to go off the chart? And this concept of the fat tail, it never really resolved the problem. And what I'm saying is that approach, it doesn't really work because the risk is a second order concept in the analysis. What I've done is said, look, we need to take the risk as a first order problem, and then the cost becomes second order. It's sort of complementary and opposite. So when risks are the first order problem, it fits very nicely into the carrots which balance sticks. So you've got this nice symmetry that we cover both the risks and the costs, and with carrots and sticks. So you have another channel of being able to fund or create a price signal. But here is where it gets interesting. if the carrot is the appropriate policy option to manage the risks, then you got to check it out and say, well, can it actually do that? Does it actually manage all the different systemic risks? Because there are many risks. And the paper I'm writing explains this, and it claims that, yes, it does actually, because there are multiple risks that need to be addressed with the reward, and it can be done. One is to pay for the removal, right? Because that's a straight grant cost. You need to be able to quickly decarbonize the energy sector with these energy asset exchanges that we're discussing. You need to be able to fully fund all this other mitigation quickly. And then, for example, we've got economic instability and geopolitical risk. So this price signal that we discussed a moment ago, the store of value that the world can enjoy or appreciate, that potentially can help stabilize the world economy and mitigate against geopolitical risk. So if we think now about geopolitics, the idea behind the central bank mandates and the agreement to support the carbon coin is the idea that the central banks of the world won't simply be given a mandate. It will be a mandate with very strong guarantees that all the central banks will play ball. They're not going to leave the policy unilaterally just because they're unhappy with some president somewhere in the world, say begins with the name P, you know, or something like that. They're going to have to stay on board, and there will be rules and protocols so that the market globally can trust that the price will actually continue to perform for decades into the future and right through the end of the century into the next century. My prediction, actually, if we do have this policy, it will become a permanent feature of the world economy because we're always going to have residual emissions. Can't be avoided.
I like this phrase, Deltonomics. Delton. So I even made a little bit of music about that. I sent you the link, right? No,
Yeah,
it's
right.
so cool. It's so cool. I mean, yeah. So what about Norway, Tanzania, and Cameroon? Maybe these can be the three three countries. Maybe we should organize a conference or something and get all the central banks to come to, I don't know, Brisbane or Berlin or London or something like that. Could you dive a little bit more into this or explain what you meant about first order risk becoming the first order? What does that mean? You lost me there a little bit.
Yeah, it's not easy to understand, actually. The concept of risk and the concept of cost is something I really struggled with when working on this policy, because I had an intuition that this is fundamentally important. Now, the point is, by example, we can explain the phenomena, because risk and cost have different dimensions. So a cost typically occurs when you plan to do something and you want to spend an amount of money that equates with the benefit. For example, you're driving from home to the supermarket to go shopping. You will spend a certain amount of money to get there on petrol or catching a bus, and you can plan that.
Yeah.
And you figured out that the cost and benefit is worthwhile. So that's a very simple example of a cost, a trivial one, but a good one. Now, if you're walking to the supermarket, okay, in this example, you're coming close to the supermarket, but you've got to cross a busy street.
Okay.
Now, the busy street has big trucks and buses and fast-moving vehicles. So when you're crossing the street, in this example, there's no traffic lights. You've got to just get across the street. Are you going to use the same cost-based planning to cross the street? And the answer is no, because it's a much more dynamic problem, and you're going to switch over to considering probabilities. So you're going to judge that when you cross the street, the probability of being hit by a vehicle is low enough that you're willing to do it. Now, you're not going to factor in how much it's going to cost you to cross the street, because it could vary from virtually no cost to being killed.
Yeah.
You
Which
know,
is expensive.
maybe being killed is better than just having to go to hospital, because if you go to hospital, you could have lifetime mental injuries or something, you know, broken leg or anything. So this dynamic kind of problem, probabilities are primary and cost is secondary. Now, this is where economics struggles, because although it's not stated explicitly, neoclassical economics is actually based on costs, not risks, in the first order. And that's exactly what I'm saying, because there is an implicit assumption that climate change is not so dynamic that the whole problem needs to be considered from a risk-based perspective. And this is where I present the case that's not true. It is a systemic problem, a systemic risk. In fact, I argue we need to rename the market failure as a systemic market failure because of the systemic risks. And to make this more readily understood, I've had to explain what the systemic risks are, where they come from, and to classify them. Once we understand that they emanate from societal systems like the economy, financial system, political system, and that they also involve earth systems because of their tendency to be non-linear,
Yeah,
to have feedback loops,
yeah.
Tipping points, and so on. Once we understand what systemic risks actually are, it makes more sense to then have a price to manage those risks. But because we're looking at the probabilities in the first order and costs in the second order, we don't worry too much about the costs. In other words, what we do is we spend what it takes to manage the risks. Just as when you're crossing that street, you're not going to worry about how much it costs to get to the other side. You're going to manage the risks, probably in that case, by timing when you run across the street. Here, our problem is much more sophisticated than that, because we have multiple problems to deal with. We have to fund the carbon removal. We have to fund the conventional reductions of emissions in all economic sectors. And then on top of that, we're going to have to manage the environmental, ecological, and social implications of all of these activities. And that's also very important, because in order to limit the risks or manage these risks, we have to have stable ecosystems and stable communities, because if they're unstable, that introduces another risk. And hence there's this qualitative approach that needs to be included.
Okay, so we have to start thinking about, the risks of crossing, the risks of getting to the supermarket, and not just the bus fare, basically, or the train
that's
fare.
what it boils down to.
Yeah, interesting. So by talking about risk as first order, like just considering it more importantly, or also that's what you mean. Interesting. Injy, you have some comments?
Just reflecting that. I mean, I think absolutely that's exactly the right way we need to go. And that's the thing, because I think the problem is that so often we work from what is most feasible now. And again, coming back to what Delton said at the start, there's a reason why we're in this situation, and it's because the solutions really, they're not in the textbooks. And I think that's why it makes so much sense to to flip that assumption and focus from the risk rather than the cost. And also because, as we've seen, it is a very dynamic system, and that our risk of achieving or overshooting certain goals varies a lot. And then we also have this option, or some of the models as well, which predicts that, okay, we might temporarily overshoot it, but there's a risk of in the near term overshooting it, and then being able to pull that back in future. But it's again, I think it makes so much sense and helps translate really the physical climate science out into the real world, and be able to kind of align that with the economic system. in true Deltonomics fashion, which is great.
Indeed.
You heard it here first.
Yeah.
Florian, do you have a question? Otherwise, I have this diagram to show, which might be, I don't know if we can discuss this. I don't understand it really at all. So what's this?
I can quickly explain that. It's not that complicated, really.
Okay. Can you explain to our listeners what they're seeing on screen or what they're not seeing on screen?
When I gave that presentation, this was to the Bank of England, I needed some diagrams to kind of put some numbers on the amount of money that potentially policy would mobilize. And that's it. And so I just came up with some synthetic numbers based on a lot of assumptions. And then I arbitrarily allocated that money between conventional mitigation and carbon removal from the atmosphere, roughly according to what the literature says we need. So the blue line is how much money this policy would likely generate, roughly, to fund removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and sequestering it somewhere. So it's getting up to over $1 trillion a year and around 2 trillion. It's not inflation adjusted numbers, but around 2 trillion in today's numbers, mid-century, 2060, 2080 type period. And then because technology tends to improve over time, this assumes roughly a 1.5% improvement rate per annum compound through technology. And so the amount of money starts to drop off.
Okay.
Because we just get better at it in the future. The red, that's pretty close, roughly, to how much we need to spend on everything else. That's the energy transition, decarbonizing every sector of the economy. And it starts low because we're basically only at, actually, this is, in some respects, this might be a bit low, but we might be investing around $1 trillion today in mitigation. Some organizations think it should go up to around 9 trillion, but I'm just basing these numbers on the IEA, the International Energy Agency's figure for the clean energy transition, when they've sort of pegged it at around 3 trillion a year additional needed for the clean energy transition. But that might be lowballing it because there might be a lot of other things that need to be done. But then again, I'm not entirely sure how much this reward will leverage up other finance. So like if you put in $1, will that leverage another $2? And that would get us to the 9 trillion maybe. So there's some subjectivity there. And so that's pretty much it. That's the amount of money we're looking at. And it's in the trillions, 3-4 trillion a year if you aggregate it. It's a lot of money, more than any one country can afford. This is why we need to move to international agreement to mobilize the money. And the beautiful thing about the reward, in my opinion, is that it doesn't force any direct costs on any person, business, or government. It takes the money out of fiscal accounts and puts it into the carbon reward. And what it does is it attracts private investment into that. We reallocate capital through that process and it funds it. And if there's not enough private investment, that's when the central banks come in and become the buyer that's missing, the buyer of last resort.
Thanks, Dalton. Florian?
Just a quick time check. We are just a bit past 12:30, so I think it could be time to wrap this very interesting conversation up.
I don't want to hog all the time. I didn't give much time to talk, Florian or Injy. Did you want to change the topic or ask a question of me? More than welcome.
Yeah, I think it could be interesting to delve into. I mean, so I guess coming back to why I was bringing up the distinction between the different types of projects and maybe the risk I see in the global carbon reward kind of embracing both the avoided emissions, the emissions reductions, and the carbon removal, is that, because they're fundamentally very different things, they've got these very different price points. And then the MRV, the monitoring, reporting, verification requirements also differ quite a lot depending on that type. And so, yeah, I was just interested whether you did initially consider differentiating between the different types of mitigation, or whether the idea is that there's more power in trying to adapt them to become more fungible. But yeah, interested in that process.
Yes, this is a very important question, because I realized that carbon removals versus carbon reductions or emissions reductions or avoided emissions are different in many ways. With reductions, conventional mitigation, there are so many different technologies involved and so many different MRV requirements that it would become unwieldy or complicated if we only had one price for all of that. So the way the policy works, I think industry will really like, and that is we have one explicit price for removals, and we treat that as one global market with one price signal. And then for everything else, it's the pricing is really customized. So we're not restricted by a price signal per se. We can develop bespoke formulas that give customized rewards to every industry, so that we can try and hit the price points that will get the mitigation actions when we need them. Because some industries, take aviation, for example, it must be hugely expensive to figure out how to build planes that don't need aviation gas. You know what I mean? That's a pretty tricky one. Whereas something maybe like steel manufacturing is fairly straightforward. So the different costs and price points, and that's why the policy is structured for that flexibility. And the MRV, similarly, the way MRV is going to be funded, I believe, is that there will be a commission built in to pay for MRV. So for every project that's being rewarded, maybe 3% of the reward is allocated to pay for MRV and all the assessments. That way, it's nations don't have to pay for it directly. It can be self-funded.
Yeah, but that's what makes it interesting as well, because even within removals, right, both the MRV and then how to address reversals differs hugely depending on the technology. You know, if it's a forest and needing to replant that and monitor that over longer timescales versus maybe mineralization or something where, you know, you're kind of turning carbon back into concrete. But yeah, that's great to hear that there's that initial distinction, and I think it'll be really interesting to delve a bit deeper into how to kind of tailor it within the very diverse world of removals as well. But yeah, I think there's a lot of promise here, and a lot of good signals as well within the broader paradigm of the fact that countries are also quite interested in how to integrate removals into their compliance markets, which is raising these same kind of questions about fungibility and about how to ensure that, yeah, basically what you're trading is the same thing, and you've got confidence in that ultimate unit, which I think again will reveal some interesting lessons for how to apply the global carbon reward.
And for our listeners, MRV is monitoring, removal, and verification. Is that it? No, monitoring. Come on, then tell me.
Reporting.
Reporting.
Yeah.
Okay. No. Monitoring, reporting, and verification. Okay.
Do you call it monitoring or measurement? Measurement, reporting, verification.
Yeah, that one can can change. I'm tend to call it monitoring, but yeah, measurement. It's yeah. Also, there's many acronyms.
There are organizations doing that already, right? In some of the.
Yeah, but then coming back to the cost point, the issue is, and we're getting increasingly amazing kind of technologies, you know, integrating satellite and LiDAR and all these amazing things. But the issue is, what we're seeing is that maybe the more you focus on ensuring that 1 ton is stored here, or that, you know, this 1 meter plot of forest is intact, is that it starts taking more and more money away from actually scaling the technology or scaling the project. And so that's why these both, like, yeah, we have to pay attention to both the different qualities of the projects in terms of what they're doing on the ground, but also the different costs of ensuring that they can be accurately stored. And also because if it's, in my view, if there's a trade-off between accurately ensuring that this one tree kind of is stayed into planting versus planting 4 or 5 more trees for that same price. I would go for the latter option, but I think that's where the questions of not tokenization, but how to ensure that it's the fundamental unit stays the same. That trade-off for the stability versus scale potentially is a really interesting one, and I think it becomes very technology dependent. But yeah, a lot of room for further conversation.
Absolutely. So maybe we should draw a little bit to a close, but I was just wondering, like what the next steps are for the Global Carbon Reward, Delton. So is there going to be a conference, or like next week? I mean, what are the next steps?
Yes, for the next steps, I'm going to complete the draft of a new paper. And this paper is quite big, and it explains the theory and the underlying principles of the policy. So it explains systemic risks, the addition to neoclassical economics, the carbon pricing matrix that we looked at earlier,
Yep.
and the macro strategy of the policy and the micro strategies to cover all these topics we discussed and more. And that's over 60 pages. And so the event is to invite people, particularly from Oxford or other think tanks and universities, to read some of it and offer to do a review on a webinar just like this, where we could go through it, critique it, and then if organizations like the policy, maybe they'll put their logo on it and help promote it when it's published. That's that. The other events that the policy has been submitted to the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue for COP, and hopefully the people involved in that dialogue will read our work and take an interest. If they do, they might invite me to the COP.
Okay, fantastic.
And the other action or event is that we are trying to raise money and support for the project.
Okay.
And so we can't do too much without any money. And so if people have any ideas, or if they have a big fat checkbook, yeah, definitely give us a call.
Good. So we'll put the website in the show notes. And yeah, so listen, this has been fantastic. I think I echo Florian in that regard as well. Very interesting and much needed innovation going on here. So thanks, Injy Johnstone and Delton Chen, and my co-host Florian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And yeah, let's see how the recording worked out. We'll be in touch. Have a great rest of the day, folks.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.